Under a cold silver moon, the desert breathed like something alive. The wind whispered through dry grass and carried the scent of distant rain. Out there beyond the canyon and the dying firelight, a lone Apache moved through the night on silent feet. His moccasins left no mark on the earth. He carried no weapon drawn, only the instinct that had guided him through 100 lonely miles of wilderness. The stars above were sharp and unblinking, and he had learned long ago that when the night felt this still, something unseen was waiting. The old barn stood near the edge of a forgotten ranchwood cracked, roof sagging, half swallowed by weeds. It had once belonged to settlers who vanished seasons ago, leaving only ghosts and wind to guard the place. For days, the Apache had passed by that barn on his hunts, paying it no mind. But tonight, there was a sound that didn't belong. A muffled, cry-soft human, frightened. He froze in the darkness, head tilting, breath held. Another whimper followed, the sound of life clinging to silence. He moved closer, the lantern light from his hand flickering across the wooden walls. The old door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of hay, damp earth, and something else, blood and milk. His eyes adjusted to the dim glow, and there she was. A young woman lay in the straw, her dress torn, and her skin pale as moonlight. In her trembling arms were 2 small bundles wrapped in cloth, the faintest cries slipping out between her whispers. For a moment, neither moved. She looked up at him, eyes wide with terror. To her, he was a shadow from stories told around campfires, a warrior with braids and scars, dressed in leather, a symbol of everything she'd been taught to fear. Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to speak, but only a broken whisper came out. The babies stirred, their tiny fingers clutching at the cloth, unaware of the gulf of fear standing between their mother and the man who found them. He slowly lowered his lantern, careful not to startle her. "You're hurt," he said in a low, steady tone. His English was rough, learned through traders and soldiers long gone. She shook her head, clutching the infants tighter, as though one wrong move would steal them away. The Apache could see the fever in her eyes, the tremble in her lips. She had not eaten in days. The barn was cold. The wind cut through the cracks in the wall. The baby's cries were growing weaker. Outside, coyotes called in the distance, their howls echoing through the hills. He looked toward the sound, then back at her. "They'll come closer," he murmured. "This place not safe." Still she did not answer. Her fear was stronger than her pain. She'd likely fled from something, perhaps a raid, perhaps a man, perhaps hunger itself. But whatever it was, it had driven her to this lonely ruin in the desert, where death waited in silence. He crouched a few feet away, setting the lantern down so its glow fell softly over her face. Her hands shook as she tried to feed one of the babies, but her body had nothing left to give. The Apache could see that. He had seen women die from less. The thought made something heavy twist inside him. "I won't hurt you," he said again, slowly, each word deliberate. "I help." Her eyes softened for just a heartbeat, then filled with tears. "Please," she whispered, "don't take them." Her voice broke into a sob, the sound fragile in the cold air. "They've done nothing wrong." He frowned, not understanding at first. "Take," she shook her head, the movement weak. "Men came. They wanted the babies." She looked away as if remembering burned her. "I ran. They said they'd find us. I can't." Her words trailed off into trembling silence. The Apache's jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of cruelty before. Out here, the desert had no mercy, and neither did men who carried greed in their hearts. He stood and stepped toward her, his shadow falling across the straw. She flinched, pressing the children closer. He stopped. "You have name?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer, only stared back with eyes full of both defiance and exhaustion. He sighed, realizing there was no use asking more tonight. She wouldn't trust him until he proved she could. He walked to a corner of the barn, took a wool blanket from his horse's saddlebag, and laid it near her. Then, without another word, he moved back to the doorway, standing guard. The storm outside was rising, no thunder rumbling far beyond the hills. The wind carried dust through the cracks, and the wooden beams groaned with the weight of the night. Behind him, a woman tried to calm the crying infants, humming a broken tune. It was a sound that made something stir in him, a faint memory of his own mother. Long gone, singing by the fire when he was a child. He closed his eyes, listening to the song fade into quiet. When the rain began to fall, the Apache turned. The lantern light flickered against the boards, casting warm colors over her face. The babies had fallen asleep at last, their tiny chests rising and falling in rhythm. The woman lay beside them, eyelids heavy, but not yet closed. "You ride?" he asked softly. "Tomorrow, I take you from here." She didn't answer, but he saw her hand move slightly toward the babies, as if to shield them. Then her voice came, faint but clear. "Why are you helping me?" The question hung in the air between them. The Apache stared at the flame in the lantern, its light trembling like a heartbeat. "Because no one helped my people," he said finally. "Not when we needed it." The woman looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face for truth. Something in his tone, perhaps the quiet pain beneath it, made her chest tighten. She wanted to believe him, but fear had built walls too high. "Still," she whispered then, "thank you." He nodded once and turned back toward the storm. Hours passed. The night deepened. The sound of horses echoed faintly beyond the ridge. The Apache's hand went to the knife at his side. He moved to the edge of the barn, peering through the rain. In the distance, torchlight flickered. Not thunder now, but men. He could see their shapes moving across the hill, calling to each other. Searching, he returned to the barn, his expression hard. The woman had heard them too. Her eyes widened in panic as she clutched her babies. "They found us," she whispered. He put a finger to his lips. "Quiet," he said. "Stay still." He blew out the lantern, plunging the barn into darkness. The only light came from the thin gaps in the wall, where rain shimmered like silver threads. The hoofbeats grew louder. Voices called out in the distance. The Apache crouched near the door, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the ridge. He could feel their approach, the weight of danger pressing closer with every heartbeat. Behind him, the woman held her children close, trembling. One of the babies stirred and began to whimper. She pressed her hand gently over its mouth, praying the sound wouldn't carry. The Apache's hand tightened around his blade. Lightning split the sky outside, revealing the silhouettes of 3 riders moving through the rain. They dismounted near the fence, scanning the ground. One of them pointed toward the barn. The Apache turned, his eyes meeting hers through the dark. "If they come," he whispered, "don't move, no matter what happens." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to ask what he meant, what he planned to do, but before she could speak, he was already moving silent as a shadow toward the side door. The storm roared louder, drowning the sound of his steps. The woman's heart pounded as she held her babies tighter. The horses outside snorted. A man's voice shouted something she couldn't make out. Then came the creak of the barn door, slow and deliberate, and in that instant between lightning and darkness, she saw a hand push the door open. The glow of a torch spilled across the straw, and a shadow stepped inside. The rain outside drowned her whisper as she prayed the Apache would return before it was too late. The barn door creaked wider as the wind howled through the cracks. Rain spilled from the roof in steady drops, splattering across the dirt floor. The woman's heart thumped so loud she feared the men could hear it. One of the babies stirred, letting out a soft whimper that sliced through the sound of the storm. She pressed the child closer to her chest, whispering prayers she could barely form. The man with the torch stepped inside. His boots crushed the hay as he moved, scanning the dim barn with suspicious eyes. His coat was soaked through, his beard heavy with rain. 2 others followed behind him, one carrying a rifle, the other clutching a rope. They looked like bounty men or hired guns, men who'd traded mercy for coin long ago. The leader held the torch higher, the flame casting his shadow against the wall. "Check every corner," he barked. "Tracks lead here." The woman felt her throat tighten. She could almost taste the fear in her mouth, dry and bitter. The babies began to fuss again, and she rocked them as silently as she could, praying the noise of the storm would hide them. Then, from the far side of the barn, A sound broke the tension, a sudden clatter, a flash of motion. One of the men swung the torch toward it, shouting, "There!" But before they could move, a dark shape lunged from the shadows. The Apache's hand gripped the nearest man's collar, dragging him into the darkness with silent precision. There was a dull thud, then another. The torch wavered, light shaking wildly across the walls. The leader cursed, raising his rifle. "Show yourself." The Apache's voice came low and cold from the darkness. "Leave." The man fired blindly toward the sound, the gun's crack echoing off the walls. The horses outside whinnied in fear. The woman gasped and ducked lower, curling her body around the babies. The leader turned, shouting for the others, but one of them was already down, motionless in the straw. When lightning flashed through the cracks in the barn, he finally saw him. The Apache stood between the stalls, soaked in rain, his chest bare and muscles taut under the dim light. His long black hair clung to his shoulders, and the faint lines of tribal markings crossed his arms. His eyes burned with a quiet fury, not wild but focused, like the calm before a hunt. The man hesitated, gripping his rifle tighter. "You got no place in this, savage," he growled. "She's ours. The baby's too." The Apache's jaw set, and his voice dropped lower. "Not tonight." He moved fast, too fast for the man to aim again. The rifle was knocked aside. The torch hit the dirt, and the barn filled with the smell of burning straw. The leader swung a knife, but the Apache caught his wrist, twisting until the blade clattered to the ground. They struggled in the flickering light, boots slipping in the mud. A final strike sent the man crashing into a wooden beam, breath knocked from his lungs. He slumped to the floor, groaning before going still. The Apache grabbed the torch, stomping it out before the flame could spread. Then he turned toward her. "You stay quiet," he said, his breathing heavy but steady. "We ride soon." She stared at him, shaking. "Who were they?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down at the men sprawled across the dirt, then at the tracks leading back into the storm. "People who sell others," he said simply. "They hunt the weak." "You ran from them," her eyes filled with tears. She nodded slowly, unable to speak. Outside, thunder rolled again. He walked toward the door and looked into the distance. The rain had washed away most of the tracks, but he knew they wouldn't stop. There would be more men, the kind who wouldn't rest until they found what they thought belonged to them. He turned back. "You must tell me where you come from," he said quietly. "Who sent them?" She hesitated. "A ranch north of here. It used to belong to my husband's family. But he's gone, taken by fever last winter. When he died, the ranch hands turned cruel. The man who took over wanted me." She swallowed hard. "When I refused, he said I'd be replaced. Said I'd starve. Then he learned I was carrying twins, and he called them a curse." Her eyes drifted to the sleeping infants, her voice trembling. "He sent men to take them. Said I wasn't fit to keep them." Apache said nothing for a moment. He knew the kind of men she spoke of. He'd seen settlers who built their fences higher than their hearts, who treated people like property, who'd forgotten that mercy once lived in them. "You ran far," he finally said. "Through desert. That is not easy. I didn't have a choice." He nodded. "You chose right." She looked at him with cautious gratitude. "Why do you care?" He met her gaze. "Because once, my people ran too. Soldiers came, took everything. Women, children, burned what was left. We had to choose, run or die. Some of us still running." The silence that followed was heavy. Only the rain and the soft breathing of the babies broke it. He moved toward his horse, which waited patiently near the door, steam rising from its coat. He took a blanket and some dried meat from the saddlebag, then handed the food to her. "Eat. You need strength." She hesitated but took it. The salt burned her lips, but it was the first thing she'd eaten in 2 days. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling warmth return to her body. When she opened them again, he was tying up the unconscious men with rope. "You won't kill them?" she asked. He shook his head. "Killing calls more killing. We leave them for the rain." She watched him in silence as he worked. The way he moved, calm, deliberate, reminded her of someone who had lived through more than he spoke of. Every motion seemed born from years of survival. As dawn began to edge across the horizon, the rain softened. Mist clung to the ground like a veil. The Apache saddled his horse and gathered the few things they could carry. "We ride for the mountains," he said. "There is a place where no one follows." She stared at him, exhausted and uncertain. "I can't ride far." "The babies I help you," he said simply. "But we go now. When the sun rises, they will come again." She knew he was right, so she nodded weakly, clutching the infants close as he lifted her onto the horse. He climbed behind, steadying her with one arm. The warmth of his body was solid, protective. The horse moved through the wet fields, hooves sinking into the soft earth. The barn faded behind them as they rode toward the canyon. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and rain. For the first time in days, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: safety, however brief. But the Apache knew better. Safety in these lands was never more than borrowed time. As they rode, he kept scanning the horizon. Every sound mattered: the cry of a hawk, the roll of distant thunder, the shifting of hooves behind them. He'd learned to trust the language of the land more than the words of men. The woman leaned forward slightly. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. He was silent for a moment before answering. "They called me Crow in the camps. It was not my first name." "What was your first name?" He looked toward the rising sun. "One, I don't speak anymore." She didn't ask again. The canyon walls grew taller around them, their red stone glistening from the rain. He guided the horse into a narrow pass, hidden by brush. At its end stood a small hollow beneath the cliffsand, old shelter once used by travelers or hunters. He dismounted and helped her down. "Rest here. Fire will keep us warm." She nodded, cradling the babies as he built a small fire with dry twigs. Smoke curled upward, faint and silver. The warmth filled the cave slowly, and the children began to stir. "Will they follow us here?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "But not today. Trail washed by rain. We have time." Her eyes met his, and for a moment she saw the weight he carried, the losses he didn't speak of, the silence that lived behind his strength. She wanted to ask more, but her voice failed her. As the fire crackled, the babies began to cry softly. She tried to calm them, her hands trembling with exhaustion. Crow watched for a moment, then reached into his pouch, pulling out a piece of dried corn mush softened with water. "Try this," he said. "Old way. Will help them sleep." She hesitated but accepted it. When the babies finally quieted, she looked up. "Thank you," gave a short nod, eyes on the flames. "You keep them alive. That is strength." The sound of the wind outside shifted, carrying a distant rhythm: hoofbeats, faint but certain. The Apache's head lifted, eyes narrowing. He stood slowly, moving to the mouth of the cave. The woman followed his gaze, fear returning like a wave. "Is it them?" she whispered. He didn't answer. His hand brushed the hilt of his knife again, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Stay with the children." Outside, beyond the mist, something moved through the canyon. The faint echo of men's voices reached them, swallowed by the wind. The Apache stepped into the shadows, disappearing like he'd never been there. The woman clutched her babies close, her heart pounding. The fire crackled quietly beside her, its light trembling against the stone walls. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried a lonely sound over the endless desert. She didn't know if it was a warning or a promise. But she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, the storm had only just begun. The faint glow of dawn was swallowed again by clouds that rolled low over the mountains. The cave felt smaller as the wind outside grew wilder, carrying with it the scent of smoke and something else: gunpowder. The Apache stood near the entrance, his body still, his eyes following every movement in the valley below. Tracks had been washed away by the rain, but he could tell from the rhythm of the land that riders were close. He could sense it in the silence of the birds, and the way his horse shifted uneasily. Nostrils flaring inside, the woman rocked her babies, her arms tightening as she watched him. The firelight caught the side of his face, showing lines carved deep from years of hardship. He looked like part of the land itself, quiet, steady, impossible to move. But beneath that calm, she sensed something restless. He wasn't just protecting her. He was fighting something older, something he'd carried far longer than this storm. He turned and spoke softly. "They are near. 2 miles? Maybe less?" Her voice trembled. "How do you know?" He pointed toward the ridge. "Smoke. They burn sage when they track. Hides their scent, confuses horses. I know their ways." She looked toward the dark outline of the cliffs, her throat tight. "Then they'll find us." He shook his head. "Not yet, but soon." He crouched near the fire, adding another stick. "When sun rises high, we move north. There's a place old mission, half stone, half ruin. You can rest there. But if they follow, we must not stay." She hesitated, then said quietly, "You've done enough. You don't have to risk your life for me." He looked at her, expression unreadable. "I said I would help, but why? You don't even know me." He poked the fire with a stick, the sparks rising between them. "I don't need to know you. You carry life. That is reason enough." Her eyes filled with tears she didn't want him to see. No one had spoken to her like that since her husband died. Out there in the wild, mercy felt rarer than rain. Hours passed slowly. The wind outside calmed, but the weight of danger stayed. Crotha named she'd come to know him. Bai moved in and out of the cave, watching the valley. He found animal tracks, broken twigs, and the faint mark of hooves that hadn't been there before. The men were close, and from the looks of the trail, they weren't just trackers. They were armed and organized, likely part of a larger group. Inside the cave, the woman whispered softly to her children, trying to calm their fussing. The baby's soft cries echoed off the stone, each sound making Crow glance back sharply. "They must stay quiet," he murmured. "Sound carries far in the mountains." "I'm trying," she said helplessly. "They're hungry." He reached for his pouch again, offering her a small piece of dried corn mash. "Not much, but it will help," as she fed them. Her thoughts drifted back to the ranch she'd fled from. The image of the man who had taken her husband's land haunted her the way he'd smiled as he gave orders. The way his men had tied her hands when she'd tried to run. His name was Briggs, a man who wore polished boots and spoke like law itself, but whose heart was black as the tar that sealed the roads leading to his house. He'd called himself a savior of settlers, yet every acre he owned had been stolen from someone else. Briggs wanted her children because he believed they carried something valuable her late husband's claim to land rich with water and minerals. She didn't understand it fully, but she knew one thing. If Briggs found them, he wouldn't stop until everything she loved was gone. Back near the cave entrance, Crow knelt in the dirt, drawing lines with his finger. "They come from 2 sides," he said, more to himself than her. "They want a corner. I can lead them away." She shook her head, fear in her voice. "No, if you go, they'll kill you." He looked up at her, eyes steady. "If I stay, they find you. This way, they follow me. You hide, wait for night." She wanted to argue, but something in his voice, something calm and final, made her stop. "You can't face them alone. I have before," he said simply. "Men like them think numbers make them strong, but they don't know this land." Before she could respond, one of the babies began to cry again, louder this time. The sound pierced through the still air. Crow stiffened, his head turning sharply toward the ridge. "They heard," he whispered. "They move fast now." He grabbed his bow and quiver from the wall, his movements precise. The woman rose to her feet, clutching both children. "What do I do?" He glanced at her. "Go to the back of the cave. There's a tunnel that opens higher up the hill. Stay hidden. If I don't return by night, keep riding north until you find water." Her voice broke. "And you?" He hesitated. "I'll meet you at the mission. If not, follow the river. It will lead to safe ground." Before she could say another word, he was gone, vanishing into the mist like smoke. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the sound of horses through the valley. Crow moved swiftly across the rocks, his body blending with the shadows. He could see them now for riders, torches in hand, spreading out near the cliffs. They were searching in patterns, trained but not careful enough. One of them dismounted, examining the ground where the horse tracks had ended. Crow recognized him, the tall man with a scar across his cheek. One of Briggs's men crouched low behind a boulder, pulling an arrow from his quiver. He didn't aim to kill unless he had to. But if they found her trail, he'd have no choice. Meanwhile, inside the cave, the woman followed his instructions. She found the narrow passage hidden behind a pile of rocks and crawled through, holding her babies tight against her chest. The passage was dark and rough, the air thin. She could barely see the faint light at the other end. Every sound from outside, the shout of a man. The ring of metal made her heart race faster. When she finally reached the upper opening, she saw the valley below. Through the trees, she could make out small bursts of orange light torches moving in circles. Then faintly, she heard something else, a whistle, low and short. It was Crow's signal. He was drawing them away, but as the torches began to move down the slope, one broke off from the group. A rider had turned toward the higher ground, heading straight for the hill where she hid. Panic clawed at her throat. She pressed herself against the rock, whispering to the babies to stay quiet. The rider's horse snorted, hooves crunching the loose stones. The man's voice carried faintly through the mist. "She's up here somewhere. I saw movement." The woman's arms trembled. She looked down at her children's tiny faces sleeping through danger, and prayed that whatever force had guided her this far wouldn't fail her now. Then a sudden crack echoed through the valley. The rider's horse reared violently, throwing its rider to the ground. The man shouted, scrambling for his rifle, but another sound followed, a thud, sharp and final. Crow emerged from the fog behind him, bow lowered, his eyes cold. He turned toward the hill where she hid, motioning for her to stay low. "They're leaving," he said quietly. "For now." She wanted to ask what happened, but his tone told her not to. He walked beside her as they made their way down the hill, his body tense, every sense alert. When they reached the cave again, the fire had gone out. The smoke hung low, a ghostly reminder of how close danger had come. She sat down, clutching her children, while Crow cleaned his knife. His silence weighed heavy in the air. Finally, she spoke. "You risked your life for strangers. What if they come again?" "They will," he said without looking up. "Men like them don't stop until they lose what they came for." "And Briggs?" "He won't forget Briggs," she whispered. "You know his name?" He nodded slowly. "I've crossed his kind before. He sends men to steal land, burn villages, take people. He thinks the desert belongs to him. He's wrong." Her heart pounded. "You've fought him before?" Crow's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw anger flash beneath his calm. "Once, years ago, when he built his first ranch near the river. My people lived there before him. He drove them off. My father was killed, trying to defend our ground." He paused, voice low and heavy. "Briggs built his fortune on bones." The woman's eyes widened as she realized the depth of what bound them. "Then you have a reason to fight him," he nodded. "And now so do you." The night grew darker, the air colder. The baby slept beside her, bundled in his old blanket. Crow sat near the entrance, watching the valley with unblinking focus. The firelight caught the edge of his face, showing both strength and sorrow. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a wolf howled a long, lonely cry. The woman shivered and looked at him. "Do you think we'll make it?" His eyes stayed on the horizon. "If we move before dawn," he said, "maybe. But Briggs will come himself next time. He won't send men again. He'll want to see what kind of woman defied him and what kind of Apache stands beside her." She said nothing after that. The fire crackled once, then went quiet. Outside, the moon disappeared behind clouds, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. Both of them knew that the next sunrise wouldn't bring peace. It would bring a reckoning neither could escape, the night before the storm broke. The desert was so still it seemed to listen. The stars hung low, sharp as knife points, and the air carried a strange heaviness that whispered of danger. Crow hadn't slept. He stood outside the old mission, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the darkness deepened. The woman and her twins slept inside, wrapped in blankets near a dying fire. Every few moments, Crow's hand brushed the hilt of his knife, his instincts on edge. He had seen too many nights like this before, a fight the quiet before the land erupted with violence. By dawn, the silence shattered. The faint echo of horses came from the west. He counted 5 riders by sound alone, their rhythm heavy and careless. Men used to hunting without fear. He moved quietly to the doorway and glanced back. The woman was awake now, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held her children. She knew. "Is it them?" she whispered. Crow nodded. "They found our trail." Her breath hitched. "Then we can't stay." He shook his head. "If we run now, they'll catch us in the open. This place is stone. It can hold for a while." He walked to his horse and pulled a small pouch from the saddle. Inside were a few lead bullets and a single, well-worn revolver, an old Colt that had seen better days. He checked the cylinder. 5 rounds left. He slipped it into his belt beside the knife and said quietly, "When I say go, you take the children and run to the back. There's a path through the canyon. Don't stop." She shook her head fiercely. "I won't leave you." His eyes softened. "You must. I can buy you time, but do as I say." His tone left no space for argument. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder. The sound rolled over the land like thunder. Crow stepped into the doorway, his body framed by the pale morning light. He could see them now, 5 figures on horseback, moving with purpose. At the front rode a man in a dark coat, his hat pulled low. Briggs. The man's posture carried the arrogance of someone who believed he owned everything he looked upon. Briggs slowed his horse. Studying the mission with narrowed eyes, "You're a long way from your hunting grounds, Apache," he called out, voice deep and sharp. "You've got something that belongs to me." Crow didn't answer. He stood still as stone. Briggs smirked. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Give me the woman and those babies. You'll walk away alive." The words burned in the air. Crow's jaw tightened. He knew men like this who spoke of mercy while carrying murder in their pockets. "She's not yours," Crow said evenly. "You took her home." "You took enough," Briggs chuckled, glancing at his men. "You think she wants to live with you? You think she'll thank you when the law comes down on your head?" He leaned forward in the saddle. "There's a bounty on your kind, Apache. You're worth more dead than the gold I'll get for her." The tension snapped like a bowstring. Crow moved first. The revolver flashed once, the sound tearing through the air. One of Briggs's men fell from his horse before he could draw. The others scattered, shouting. Crow ducked behind the mission wall as bullets struck the stone, throwing dust into the air. The woman screamed, clutching her children as fragments of rock fell around them. "Stay down," Crow shouted, reloading with quick practiced movements. He fired again, hitting one of the riders in the leg. The man cried out, falling into the dirt. The others circled, trying to flank the mission. Crow moved like shadow, slipping from doorway to window, his movements sharp and measured. Every shot counted. But he was running low on ammunition, and they were closing in. Inside, the woman crawled behind a broken altar, shielding the babies with her body. The sound of gunfire filled the air, echoing through the hills. She pressed her hands over their ears, whispering prayers she barely remembered. Through the haze of smoke, she saw Briggs dismount. He walked toward the mission with slow, deliberate steps, rifle in hand, eyes gleaming like a predator. "You can't hide forever," he shouted. "I'll burn this place to the ground if I have to." Crow's voice came from somewhere near the back. "Then you'll burn with it." Briggs laughed, cold and cruel. "I like your spirit. Shame you were born on the wrong side of history," he signaled to his men. 2 of them moved toward the rear, carrying torches. Flames caught quickly on the dry brush near the walls. Smoke curled upward, thick and choking. The mission began to glow with orange light. Crow's mind raced. He couldn't fight fire and bullets both. He turned toward the woman. "You have to go. Now." She hesitated, tears streaking her soot-covered face. "What about you?" "I'll find you," he said. Though he wasn't sure if it was true, he guided her toward the back passage, pulling a loose plank aside to reveal the narrow path that led into the canyon. "Keep to the shadows. Follow the riverbed north. Don't stop until you see the ridge." She nodded, clutching the babies tight. "Crow, thank you." He gave a brief nod, then turned back toward the smoke-filled doorway. The heat was rising fast. Flames licked the edges of the walls. Briggs's men shouted from outside, their boots thudding against the stone. Crow stepped into the haze, his knife glinting in the light. One of the gunmen burst through the door, coughing from the smoke. Crow struck fast, disarming him and sending him crashing to the floor. Another followed, firing blindly. The bullet grazed Crow's arm, drawing blood, but he didn't slow. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting until the gun fell, then drove him backward into the burning debris. Outside, Briggs heard the struggle and shouted, "End it! I want them alive." But it was too late. The men inside were already down. Crow staggered against the wall, breathing hard. His vision blurred from the smoke, but he could still hear Briggs's boots crunching on the gravel outside. The sound of authority. The sound of a man who'd never had to fight for survival. Briggs stepped through the door, rifle raised. The firelight danced across his face. "You're stubborn, Apache," he said. "I'll give you that. But this ends now." Crow said nothing. He stared at the man who had taken his father's land, burned his home, and hunted those who'd tried to live free. All the years of anger, loss, and silence burned in his chest like the flames around them. "You talk too much," Crow said quietly. Before Briggs could fire, Crow lunged. The rifle went off, the bullet tearing through the air, but Crow was already inside his reach. The two men collided, their struggle half lost in the roar of the fire. The rifle clattered to the ground as they fought hand to hand. Fists and fury and smoke swirling around them. Outside, the woman reached the edge of the canyon, turning back just long enough to see the mission engulfed in flames. Her heart pounded as she searched the ridge, hoping to see him emerge through the smoke. But there was only fire and the distant sound of shouting. She hesitated, torn between running and turning back. The baby stirred in her arms, crying softly. The smoke stung her eyes, and she whispered to them, "He'll come." He promised. But the flames rose higher, painting the sky with red. Back inside, Crow and Briggs crashed against the stone floor, the heat unbearable. Crow's vision dimmed for a moment, his lungs burning. Briggs swung a broken beam at him, but Crow ducked and drove his shoulder forward, slamming the man into the wall. The beam cracked, sending sparks flying. "You can't stop what's coming," Briggs snarled. "The land will belong to men like me." Crow's voice came out hoarse but steady. "The land doesn't belong to men. It belongs to those who respect it." Briggs reached for his fallen rifle, but Crow caught his arm, twisting until it snapped. The gun fired once more, the shot echoing through the mission and out into the desert. The sound carried far, reaching the woman as she climbed through the canyon. She froze, her heart sinking. The cry of an eagle rose above the cliffs, echoing into the valley. The woman turned toward the sound, tears blurring her vision. Behind her, the flames consumed the mission, smoke spiraling into the pale sky like a warning. She whispered his name once, her voice breaking, then turned and began to run. The babies clung to her as she vanished into the winding canyon, chased by the rising sun and the memory of the man who stayed behind to fight. And in that moment, as the fire raged and the desert wind carried the smell of ash, the story reached the edge of something vast, where survival and sacrifice met, and the world waited to see which would prevail. Smoke still hung over the desert the next morning, rising in thin trails that stretched toward the pale sky. The air smelled of burned wood and rain-soaked ash. The mission was nothing more than a blackened shell, its walls crumbling under the weight of silence. Where flames had once roared, only the wind moved now, whispering through what was left. Down by the canyon stream, the woman sat with the twins wrapped in her arms. The water shimmered with the first light of dawn, calm and steady, like it had never known the fire. Her eyes were red from tears and smoke, her face streaked with dust. But she kept rocking the children gently, whispering to them as if her voice alone could keep them safe. Every sound made her look back toward the ridge, waiting for him. She had waited through the night, heart pounding with every echo, every crack of thunder. But Crow hadn't come. The fire had swallowed the mission before she could see who had lived or died inside. Still, something deep in her refused to believe he was gone. He was too much a part of the land, too strong to be claimed by the fire. She held on to that thought like a prayer. The twins stirred in her arms. She smiled faintly, brushing the dirt from their tiny faces. They were all she had left now. But when she looked toward the horizon, she remembered what he had said about the mission, about the ridge, about the way the river would guide her north to safety. So she did what she had promised. She followed the river. The land changed as she moved. The red cliffs gave way to softer hills covered in sage and dry grass. Her feet ached, her throat burned, but she kept going. By afternoon, the storm had passed, and the sky turned a deep, clean blue. Somewhere far behind, she could still see a faint line of smoke rising where the mission once stood. She turned away from it, holding the children close. When she finally stopped to rest, she found a small grove of cottonwoods by the riverbank. The air was cool there, the ground soft. She made a small bed of grass for the babies and leaned back against a rock, closing her eyes for the first time in days. Her mind drifted between memories her husband's laughter. The day the ranch burned, the sound of Crow's calm voice in the storm. A rustle of movement snapped her eyes open. She reached instinctively for the small stick she had been using as a staff, heart pounding. But when the figure stepped from the brush, she froze. He was limping, skin streaked with soot and blood, his hair still damp from the rain. One arm hung at his side, wrapped in cloth torn from his shirt. But his eyes, steady, dark, unbroken, were the same. "Crow," she whispered, her voice breaking. He gave a faint nod, breathing hard as he sank to his knees beside her. "You made it," he said quietly. She wanted to speak but could only nod as tears filled her eyes. He looked down at the twins, sleeping peacefully, and a faint smile touched his lips. "They're strong," he said, "like their mother." She shook her head. "You came back." "I thought I almost didn't," he admitted, voice rough. "The fire took everything. Briggs didn't make it." He looked toward the horizon where the smoke still rose. "The others fled when the flames spread. The land will remember what they did." For a moment, neither spoke. The river whispered beside them, carrying the sound of life through the quiet. "How did you survive?" she asked. He looked at her, then down at the ground. "The fire pushed me outside. I followed the canyon until the rain came. The desert doesn't kill those who listen to it." She reached for his arm, gently unwrapping the torn cloth. His wound was deep, but clean. She tore a piece from her own shawl, dampened it with water, and pressed it against the cut. "You should rest," she said softly. He looked at her hands, then at her face. "I will, when you're safe." The sun climbed higher, lighting the canyon in gold. The world felt different now, emptier, yet somehow calmer. The woman watched the light dance across the water and thought of everything they had left behind. The fear, the fire, the cruelty of men like Briggs, but also the courage it took to keep moving. To believe in something better. By late afternoon, Crow was strong enough to stand again. He found a small path that led toward the foothills, a trail he remembered from his youth. "There's a place beyond those trees," he said, pointing to the north. "Old land. My people used to camp there before the soldiers came. It's quiet. No one goes anymore." They walked together, the babies bundled between them. The trail wound through tall grass, past stones marked by old carvings faded by time. When they reached the clearing, the woman stopped in awe. It was a small valley surrounded by high cliffs, the clear spring bubbling from the rocks and wildflowers growing near the edge. The air smelled sweet and clean. Crow knelt beside the spring, cupping his hands to drink. "This is where I was born," he said quietly. "My mother brought me here when the raids started. We hid for weeks. She said the land would protect me if I learned to listen." The woman smiled faintly. "Did. And now it's protecting us." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. Peace. Not the quiet of solitude, but the peace of finding something worth guarding again. They built a small shelter near the spring using branches and hides from Crow's horse. At night, the baby slept between them while the fire cracked softly. Crow told her stories of the old ways of rivers that sang, of stars that guided his ancestors through darkness, of how the desert had once been full of laughter before war and greed took it. She listened, her heart warming to the rhythm of his words. Days turned into weeks. The wound on his arm healed. The babies grew stronger, their cries turning into bright laughter that echoed across the valley. The woman learned to ride, to find herbs for medicine, to start fires the way Crow did with patience and respect. In return, she taught him small things about her world, how settlers built homes of wood, how her husband once dreamed of growing apple trees in the desert. Together, they found balance in the space between both worlds. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, Crow stood at the edge of the spring, watching the colors fade from the sky. The woman came up beside him, holding one of the children in her arms. "Do you ever think of going back?" she asked. He shook his head. "There's nothing left to go back to. The land will heal itself. So will we." She nodded slowly, then looked down at the child. "They'll need a name for this place. A place to belong." Crow smiled softly. "Then you name it." She looked around the spring, the wildflowers, the open sky. "We'll call it Haven," she said, "because it saved us." He nodded. "Haven," he repeated, as if the word carried power. "Good name." The air grew still again. The same stillness that had once meant danger now filled with peace. The desert around them was vast and wild, but it no longer felt empty. The woman laid the child down beside the other and sat near the fire. Crow joined her, their shoulders touching, their silence full of understanding. The night sky opened above them, endless and bright. The stars glimmered like 1,000 campfires across the heavens. Crow looked up and whispered something in his old tongue. A blessing for the land, and for those who walked it with pure hearts. The woman didn't understand the words, but she understood their meaning. She reached for his hand and he didn't pull away. The firelight danced on their faces as the twins slept peacefully between them. The world outside finally quiet. When the wind moved through the valley, it carried no fear this time, only the scent of sage, the sound of the spring, and the memory of everything they had survived together. And though the desert would always hold its dangers, that night it felt kind, as if the land itself had chosen to give them one last gift, a home, and the promise that from the ashes of the old world, something new could still begin.